Hello, I'm the Grub Street Lodger and welcome to my library. It consists of boxes in this room here. I have moved house and so this month's reading's been a little bit strange for that. And let's go. The first book is called The Seven Wonders of the Ancient World by Celia King. And it's a book for children about the seven ancient wonders. But it's quite a high register for children. For example, here's a bit of the introduction. The wonders were chosen not only for their grandeur, but for the vision and purpose that inspired them. Their size, design and craftsmanship were without equal in the ancient world. Of the seven, only one remains today. So yeah, quite a high register. And even though each one just gets a little page, quite a lot of information. I mean, it doesn't go really in detail, like, for example, with the Artemision, they don't talk about Herostratus, who burnt one of them down to make his name live forever. And like they don't go into the controversy about, for example, the hanging gardens of Babylon, whether they even existed. But what they do is really cool pop-ups. So there's the great lighthouse. That's the Colossus of Rhodes. What we got here? The Artemision. Statue of Zeus at Olympus, which is probably the least exciting pop-up. And also, actually, the one I always forget. There's always one you forget, and that's mine. Oh no, that wasn't the Artemision. I'm so sorry. That was the Mausoleum at Halicarnassus, which I've actually seen, sort of. I've seen a bit of it in the British Museum, where it was stolen, and a bit of it in Halicarnassus. That's the Artemision. Look at that lovely background as well. It's really cool. The Hanging Gardens, and then probably the most fun pop-up is the Great Pyramid. Pyramid. So yeah, that's a very sweet little book. It's good, and the information's good. You know, it does what it wants to do. It gives you the basic information and some really cool pop-ups. The next book I read, also a very pretty element to it, is the cover. So these are drawings that Thackery did. Thackery originally wanted to be an artist. Well, originally he wanted to be a layabout. But when things went wrong and money ran out, he wanted to be an artist. He wasn't quite good enough, as you can actually tell by the drawings. That they make a brilliant cover. And he started writing, and he wrote for magazines and things. He wrote for Punch and his own magazine at the end. This was why he was writing Vanity Fair, principally. And then when that took off, he wrote other novels, which the introduction to this just hates his other novels. The first one is one I've read before, Going to See a Man Hanged, which is all about the hanging of the guy who murdered his master that started the whole anti-nougat novel Moral Panic, which Thackeray sort of added to be honest. So that's interesting. And Dickens wrote his own account of the same hanging. But this doesn't really pop until one about coats. And he just talks about coats and he characterises the coats in different ways. And he just has a lot of fun with these coats. And then it just sort of picks up, really. So there's one called Mrs. Shum's Husband, which is all about... it's sort of like this fairy tale about this man who goes off with this woman but won't ever reveal his job. And it turns out he's a street sweeper. And then there's stuff about Brighton, which is interesting as someone who was born there. A slightly icky one about his travels in Mississippi where he tries to downplay slavery. I don't like that one very much. And then some really nice reflections of his childhood, talking about how he doesn't like children's parties and things. And it's pretty good. It's not the most exciting collection ever, but as a little collection of fun light essays, it's pretty decent. It's not. I prefer, say, Idle Thoughts of a Lazy Fellow, Jerome K. Jerome, or I prefer the earlier 18th century Grub Street ones, which were more direct and ruder and just sort of less stuffy. But within those limits, it's not bad. And then the next book here is called The Light Between Worlds by Laura Weymouth. As you can see, it's got the same cover as, about 70% of all other books. And it's got a very interesting premise. Essentially, what if you came back from Narnia and the wrench of going from Narnia, where one, you've grown up into an adult and you're an important figure and it's a magical world, and now you're here in this world and you're a kid again, and what a wrench that would be. There's a problem with the book in that it borrows too much from Narnia. It even has, on the inner bit here, lampposts. Though I don't remember a very significant lamppost in the book, but lampposts. You're really you're really highlighting that this is Narnia. You're not putting a lampshade on it. You're putting a lamppost in the book, and it really is Narnia. There's a not Aslan called Service, who's a big stag, and there's a war, and it's three people, essentially not Peter, not Susan, not Lucy. And the blurb doesn't even mention that the brother goes, so that's how important he is to the story. It's about the two sisters. And the not Lucy pines for it, aches for it, and then disappears. And the not Susan then has to find out, did she kill herself or did she go back? And what it neglects, if the fictional imaginary world wasn't so Narnia, then this wouldn't be a problem, because the whole central premise of what if you went off to a magical world and then came back and had to adjust, very interesting. But because it's just so heavily Narnia coded, you think in Narnia terms. And the thing about Narnia is, of course, it's a Christian allegory. The children, Edmund, Susie, Peter, Lucy, and then Eustace and that other girl whose name I've forgotten, they go to Narnia, they learn things, they come back stronger people. And also, as Aslan says, you will know me by many names, and I have different names wherever I am. And the idea is his name here is Christ, and that you can connect to Narnia, because Narnia is the kingdom of God. It's the outcome of a Christianity. So the whole point of the book is to find Narnia in this world. And that sort of lingers because it feels unfair, really, for the trip to cause such heavy depression as it does, and it does make the book depressing. I mean, it's quite long. I mean, it's big writing, but it's quite a long book. Oh, sorry if I'm making a funny noise there. A bit dirt on my there. It's quite long for just to be wallowing in sadness. And also, because of that Narnia thing, the sadness doesn't feel warranted, because that's not what it is. And so it doesn't quite work. It's still a very interesting premise, and the writing's pretty decent. And yeah, it's not bad. I won't be checking more of that out. Got a trio of 18th century books now. The first is The Life of Orator Henley by Graham Midgely. Now, Orator Henley was a punchline in the 18th century, essentially. He was a ordained Church of England clergyman who worked in London. He worked outside of London. He worked in Melton Mowbray, where the pork pies come from. But then he moved to London. He tried to hustle himself one of the big city churches. It didn't work. He sort of was promised things and everything fell apart. And in his anger, he made his own church, essentially, called the Oratory, which was in Lincoln's Inn Fields. It was originally above a marketplace, a butcher's market. So there's lots of people taking the piss out of him of just having an audience of butchers. And he ran this oratory, and he wanted to try and bring back the rituals and sort of the beliefs of the church back to its oldest form as he could. And so he used what he thought was a 3rd or 4th century liturgy. It turns out it wasn't. It was a sort of a reporting of a possible one. But he was using that, and then he used to preach, and he had these beliefs that you could preach about anything, and that anything could be related to religion and related to the Bible. And so he'd preach about really small, weird things like hairstyles, and then bringing that back to the Bible, sometimes really spuriously. And he also he was funny, or he thought he was funny. He tried to be funny, so he used wit and humour and sarcasm in the pulpit. And this got a lot of people's goat because it was sort of seemed a bit strange having a man in a vicar collar who wasn't anymore an official member of the Church of England telling satirical contemporary jokes in a pulpit as part of a religious service. But he kept this going for 30 years, and he had his own newspaper called The Hype Doctor, which was supplemented by secret government funds because he made sure he was available to the government to shop in any weirdos that he heard about or anyone who was going to say bad things about the government. But he kept it going all that time. And his reward for that was to be mentioned in the Dunciad, where Pope eviscerates him, as Pope does to many, many other people in the Dunciad. And he's also arguing against the Grub Street Journal, which wasn't a real Grub Street Journal. It was set up originally by Pope, but run by these two other people who were essentially carrying on the Dunciad and carrying on the fights that the Dunciad started. And so that was a satirical magazine, essentially. And so he was one of their frequent targets. And also, he had an argument with Christopher Smart. So Christopher Smart wrote The Midwife magazine, in which it was from the point of view of an old lady called Mary Midnight. And then he turned that into a show. And he called the show The Old Woman's Oratory, in a sort of Mickey take of Henley. And some of the style of her orations was similar to Henley's. And Henley hated this, the idea that someone was going in drag pretending to be like him. And so he and Smart had some wars as well. And so he becomes the butt of the joke for the whole of this 30 years, essentially. He's, if ever you want to talk about a blowhard, ranting, just weird kind of person, you mentioned Orator Henley. And yet this book manages to make him really, really interesting and not completely strange and nutty. Like his disappointments in his career make sense. His harking back to older forms of worship and older ideas and older traditions had quite a lot of sway a little after he was around, and so he was kind of ahead of his time in some of these senses. Also, he tried to turn the oratory into a sort of people's university, so he tried to run all sorts of courses and things, and he wrote all these books that were supposed to be just good self-help books and knowledge for the people. Unfortunately, as it says in this, he never quite had the skills to pull off any of these grand ideas. So he never quite managed to make the People's University he wanted. And, he wrote this whole series of books about the grammar of all these different languages, but he only really spoke 4 of them, and the rest of them were pretty badly understood. One of the things he seems to be brilliant at is he seems to be the inventor of clickbait. So in his advertisements and in his own magazine, he'd send out these really confusing and peculiar sort of descriptions of what he was doing, and they didn't make sense. And the only way to make them make sense was to go to the thing and listen to it. And so he developed this really strange clickbaity style, which I find really interesting. And I was trying to find a good example of it, but as usual, I haven't pre-done it, so I'm not going to be able to find a good one, am I? But no. So he seems he comes out as a much more interesting and a much more thoughtful, and he was argumentative, and he was eccentric, and he was a little grasping, but he kept this thing going for 30 years, so it can't have been completely useless to people. It only ended when he died. So I have a lot more respect for Orator Henley now, thanks to that book. The next book is another biography, which almost seeks to try and make me have less respect for its subject. This is Samuel Johnson, The Struggle by Geoffrey Meyers. I have a lot of respect for Samuel Johnson. And I was just going to read the beginning of this the way I've read the beginning of about 15 Johnson biographies now, just to get different takes on his early life to inform my novel, which I guess I'm starting next week or the week after. And so I was starting and I thought, well, I haven't actually read this one. All the others I've read before, and I'm just rereading the first bit, but I've never actually read this one. So I read the whole thing, and the struggle he's talking about is Samuel Johnson's physical, emotional, mental, and indeed sexual struggles. His big selling point is this isn't your granddad Samuel Johnson. This Samuel Johnson says fuck. This Samuel Johnson has sex. This Samuel Johnson has bizarre sexual fantasies. In fact, it's only when he's talking about sex that he seems all that interested in the subject. And so his Samuel Johnson is someone who's heavily sexed, who only for the period of the beginning of his relationship with Tetty really has sex, but who's always thinking about it. And so his time with Hester, he puts together those few little details that could imply some sort of S&M relationship with Hester Thrale, and basically says, yes, there was an S&M, and establishes it for himself as fact, that they had a ritual whipping between them. And things like this. Now, I wouldn't be too upset by this sort of emphasis on Samuel Johnson as a sexual being, as much as I see pictures and think, ugh. Because, it is a different take and it is a different way of looking at him. And, he was a person, so he would have had drives and urges. He wasn't a saint or a statue, so, yeah. But it really is the only thing he's interested in. When it comes to talking about his work, it's really, really lackluster. There's a chapter about Grub Street, which was childish. It was just pathetic. I didn't understand even that Goldsmith met Johnson after Johnson was already famous, or that just all these little things. There were 6 pages describing his introductions to the lives of poets as kind of crap, and then says it's his best work. It just dismisses his essays as miserable, despite the fact so many of them are really funny and really well observed character pieces and things. And the thing about Rasselas, the only thing he found interesting to say was that the Happy Valley represents a giant vagina, with the forests being pubic hairs and the rivulets being, well, whatever you want the rivulets to be. And so it's not just that he focuses on the sex, it's that he's so bad at everything else. The other thing he likes to emphasise is how disgusting Johnson is. Every single opportunity to quote someone saying that Johnson is disgusting, he'll use it. Johnson gets compared to Frankenstein's monster twice. Everyone's talking about how disgusting and filthy he is when he eats. So his interest in the book is, here's Johnson. He's a really ugly, smelly, twitching, hideous, disgusting man who really wants to have sex. It's like, well, it is a different take, but I don't know. I mean, Johnson didn't seem to base a lot of his life on sex. Even if he did have he admitted he had a high sex drive. But, his life was mainly around trying to work around his high sex drive. More so to base a whole biography on it seems to be to miss a big part of his character. There you go. And the last of my little 3 18th century biographies, John Newbery and his books, Trade and Plumb-Cake Forever, Huzza, by John Rowe Townsend. It's a funny old book because it's not a new book. There's only one biography of John Newbery. It's by a man called Welsh, who he worked for the successors of John Newbery's company. And John Rowe Townsend essentially says that most of this book isn't really very applicable. Most of the John Newbery book is about his son. So he's taken out all the chapters about John Newbery himself, and he's added other bits. He's added Johnson's portrait of Newbery, which is Jack Twirler, who's a man who's always so busy with things he never actually gets anything done. So he'll sit down and he'll say, I can't eat with you today because I've got to rush off, so I'll eat with you tomorrow. But he's then gone somewhere else to say he can't eat with them because he's eating with you, and he's just always rushing everywhere and never gets anything done. And then there's a satirical thing by a man called Coleman, who's ragging on him, John Newbery and his wife, for being faux intellectual and stuff. And then it's the Welsh biography with notes to say where things are wrong and things are right. And yeah, it's about John Newbery, the publisher who published who's Jonathan? who published Samuel Johnson, Oliver Goldsmith, and Christopher Smart. So yeah, he has a touch on my three favourites. And he was in Canonbury House, and I visited Canonbury Tower, which was very cool. And yeah, he was involved in his children's work, and there's a lot of stuff about the style of the children's books he published, how nobody quite managed to get his tone, which is very jolly, but not as patronising or didactic as it got. Yeah, he does have didactic elements to his books, but they're not quite as heavy as they got in the Victorian age. And then also some stuff about his other businesses, including his medicine business, where he was the main supplier of Dr. James's fever powders, which, despite probably killing Oliver Goldsmith, Goldsmith seemed to have done most of the killing of Oliver Goldsmith by accident, were quite big until the turn of the 20th century. So these fever powders, essentially you took them, they made you throw up. And the medical idea was, well, if you got something bad in you, you need to get rid of it. And if you took too many, you got rid of too much. You lost too much energy. So yeah, it's quite good. It doesn't tell us loads about him. We get a quite a dim image of who he was. We find out a lot about what he published, and the fact that he was very much a self-made man. He was the son of a farmer, and he took himself to Reading and apprenticed himself to a printer there, and then ended up taking over the Reading Mercury, and then using that went to London and set up his bookshops and franchised out different magazines, including the Lilliputian, the magazine for children, and then he specialised in children's literature and all of this. So yeah, Newbery's an interesting man, and it's about as much information as you're going to get about him, so it's all right. The last book now sits somewhere in one of these boxes behind me, which stretch either way. And it was called The House of Tribes. It was a book about mice. It was what they call it, exofiction, where it's animals or aliens and their point of view. And this was mice. And so there's a mouse called Peddler. He is from the hedgerow. He is a country mouse. And he comes to the House of Tribes, which doesn't seem like it's a very city place, but he comes to this house, and there are tribes there. There's the smell fungus tribe in the basement with the wine. They only had 2 people in it, called Fart and Phlegm. You know what you're getting with them. There was the savage tribe. They lived in the kitchen. They were savage because they protected the larder, which they worshipped as a god because it was never empty. And then there was the book eater tribe. They ate books and as a result knew things and had really weird vocabularies. Then there was the invisibles. They lived in the attic and they loved calling things oxymorons. So there was a deaf one called Hear All Things, a clumsy one called Tread Lightly, and various other ones with silly oxymoronic names. And then there was a owl that they called Merciful because it was named by the oxymoronic naming gang, and a rat called Calog, and a shrew called Tunneler. And the mice come up with this brilliant idea. Why don't we get rid of the people? Because the people, they're stupid, they're big, they're awkward, they eat all the food. There's a little child one who's experimenting on them and feeding boiled mouse to his pet mouse. Who's called Little Prince and is really creepy. And then there's, they have 2 cats and a dog. Let's get rid of them. So they gang together and get rid of them. And that's how they discover who fills the immortal larder and what they need to do next. Yeah, it's not quite Watership Down. It doesn't have the level of lore, and it doesn't have that weird sense of, oh, this could be what being a rabbit is like. The mouse one is, it very much feels like a person going, mice, they like weeing on things, so we'll have stuff about weeing or whatever. No. Yeah, but it wasn't a bad book. It was entertaining and it was pretty fun. And it was finished and it's in here. And then I started Hudibras, but I haven't finished it, so I'll talk about that next month. Whether I talk about that next month from this building, from this room, but I will talk about it from this town, which is not London. Yeah. Here's a picture of me in the van with all my books. And here's a picture of me at the seaside. So yeah, this is my new life. Not as many theatres. I did see one thing, I forget. I reviewed Clinton Baptiste, and he is the character in Phoenix Nights, who's the psychic who goes, I'm getting a word. Nonce, and then gets punched. And it was basically that stretched out to an hour and a half. It was him insulting the audience, saying it was the spirits doing it. So, the spirits are telling me that you need a better aftershave, shit like that. It was good fun. It wasn't the big ending to end all my sort of reviewing career on, though. I was expecting a bit more. The last sentence of my reviewing career was, you'll find it funny if you think it's funny when they describe campanology as hanging out the weekend with big dongs. So yeah. I was going to go to what they called? Punch Drunk Theatre thing, where you walked barefoot and you were blindfolded and had earphones and you walked around a maze and all of this, but then they delayed it until Monday, and I'm not in London Monday now, so yeah, that's all that. Anyway, the future's bright, the future's sunny. Let's see what happens. Have a lovely one. Bye bye.